With the outbreak of COVID-19 tipping Hong Kong into recession, the HKSAR government has introduced several rounds of economic stimuli and relief measures, which may result in a current year budget deficit of about 300 billion Hong Kong dollars. Amid a rising unemployment rate and business close-downs, the government's cash payouts and wage subsidy schemes may not be sufficient to ensure full economic recovery. In the following talk, Professor Lawrence J. Lau, Ralph and Claire Landau Professor of Economics from the Lau Chor-tak Institute of Global Economics and Finance at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, shares his views on the additional fiscal measures needed to jumpstart the economy, turn around business expectations, and promote the city's long-term growth.
I'd like to talk to you a little bit about how to combat the economic downturn that we're experiencing in Hong Kong right at this moment. First of all, we know that this last quarter, the Hong Kong economy has contracted by 8.9%. And this is actually the third consecutive quarter that the Hong Kong economy has contracted, and so we are officially in a recession. At the same time, the Mainland of China has also announced that first quarter has contracted by 6.8%. And this is actually the first time the economy has contracted. I think you really have to go back in the last 40 years, I think, is the first time it contracted. Now, the Hong Kong SAR government has projected that for the rest of this year, for the whole year, it would be somewhere between minus 4% and minus 7%. And I'm actually a little bit more pessimistic. I think it would be towards the lower end of this range for the rest of the year. In the meantime, we know that the Hong Kong standing as an international financial center has actually changed. Hong Kong is now number 6. It's fallen from 3rd place to 6th place, and it is now behind Tokyo, Singapore, and Shanghai, and then just ahead of Beijing. We need to understand what is happening to the underlying trends. I think that's important. First of all, the mainland economy has been undergoing a transformation from being export-driven to being mostly domestic demand-driven. I think that's very important to know. Secondly, we know that the mainland economy is no longer just the world's factory. It becomes the world's market. That's also a big transformation. And that really means that the mainland economy is mostly driven by its own domestic demand, okay, and not by exports. Then you have to think, how does that affect Hong Kong? Hong Kong used to be a bridge, a conduit, a gateway to China. But now that China is not so export-driven, you'll see in a minute that China is also not so dependent on foreign direct investment, then what is the role of Hong Kong? We need to redefine our role under these changed circumstances. Now, this chart is very interesting. You can see that the share of exports in China, in the Chinese economy, mainland economy, has fallen now to just above 20%. Imports are roughly the same. And to give you some idea what this means, for every dollar that the China exports, value added in China, both direct and indirect together, is about 2/3, so about 66, 67 cents. Okay, so that really means that only about 13% of Chinese GDP today is generated by exports. That is the way to think about it. Now, this is how important foreign direct investment it is to China. You can see that it was very important a long time ago at the peak, but it is now only about 3% of total Chinese domestic investment. That means even if FDI stops, it's not going to have much of an impact on the Chinese macroeconomy. So I think that's important to know. This also shows that Chinese outbound investment actually has also been declining. It reached a peak in 2016, but it's been declining And I think we don't have 2020 is declined a lot in 2020. So basically what I'm trying to say is that Hong Kong's role as a middleman, as a superconnector, has largely disappeared because of the change in circumstances. And we have to understand these change in circumstances. Now, this is actually quite interesting chart. The red line actually measures the proportion of mainland Chinese trade that would come through Hong Kong, that transships in Hong Kong. At the peak, Hong Kong was responsible for 70% of Chinese exports. Think of it, 70% of all Chinese exports will come through Hong Kong. Nowadays, it's just slightly above 10%. The same is true of imports. 40% used to come through Hong Kong, and now only 10% comes through Hong Kong. And this is a natural development as ports develop in China. They have lower costs and so forth. That's really a natural development. In fact, if it weren't for the fact that there are tariffs and various other things, I think the amount of goods that would come through Hong Kong would be even less. Okay, there's transfer pricing, all sorts of things going on. Otherwise, there's really no reason for goods to be transshipped through Hong Kong. It is inevitable that there will be economic, technological, and geopolitical competition between China and the US. We know this already. They are the two largest economies in the world, and whether intentionally or unintentionally, there will be competition. It's inevitable. But the competition actually has intensified because of COVID-19. Okay, and we know that they are now blaming each other for the beginning, as the source of this epidemic. We won't talk about this today. I think eventually it's a scientific question that can be resolved. Okay. However, we have to understand that this is not likely to stop or to subside because it's election year in the US. I think it doesn't really matter Republican or Democratic. I think China will be blamed. Okay, and so you shouldn't expect that things will improve before the presidential election. Might not even improve after the presidential election, but it won't improve. So that's the new normal. But the social unrest in Hong Kong may also exacerbate the China-US conflict. I think it's unlikely to lead to any positive outcome for either Hong Kong or its people. It can only damage confidence and lower expectations about the future. I think that is really a major barrier to our economic recovery, because if people do not have positive expectations about the future, as households, they won't consume. As businesses, they won't invest. And the result is a continued recession. So I think that part is very, very important. Today, Hong Kong actually exports almost no goods, only services. And manufacturing, which has largely disappeared from Hong Kong, it will never be coming back. Think about it this way. Even Dongguan has been giving up light manufacturing. Things are moving to Southeast Asia, to Vietnam, to Bangladesh. If light manufacturing cannot return to Dongguan, how can it return to Hong Kong with a much higher cost structure? It's totally impossible. We really have to think about doing something else. We cannot go back to making shirts, making shoes, making toys. It's impractical, and it would give us only a very low level of standard of living to go back to doing things like that. So this actually gives you a good sense of what's happening. This is export to the world percent of GDP for Hong Kong. The green line is interesting. Green line is domestic exports. Hong Kong used to actually generate a great deal of goods itself. Many years ago, over 30%. But now it's close to zero. You can see the green line. The blue line is total exports of goods only, and you can see that it is actually now almost totally re-exports. That is, Hong Kong doesn't produce any goods anymore. Whatever export of goods that we have is re-exports of goods produced in the mainland. And the top red line is exports of services, and that is mostly tourism and perhaps some other things, but mostly tourism and travel would be export of services. Now, this is the same story. Exports to the U.S., you can see it actually tells the same story, that no goods, no manufactured products are being exported. But at the same time, Hong Kong's dependence on the mainland is rising. Now, I mentioned somewhere in the earlier chart that we are still getting our drinking water from China, and this is since 1960s. But this chart shows you that exports or imports to and from the mainland as a percent of Hong Kong exports and imports has been rising, and it's now over 50, 60%. And that's a very high degree of dependence. But this is comparison of the stock markets, and the red line is Shanghai plus Shenzhen, and the blue line down below is Hong Kong. So in terms of market capitalization, Hong Kong's market is actually not as large as the Shanghai and Shenzhen markets combined. And this is a very natural reason, because there are more enterprises across the border, and there's more buying power across the border. So this is actually a natural thing to happen, and that's really why the Shanghai-Hong Kong Connect and the Shenzhen-Hong Kong Connect has been helpful to the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, because there is the buying power across the border. You can see that the Hong Kong Stock Exchange actually is also fairly heavily dependent on mainland enterprises. And I think there is now actually a trend, beginning to be a trend, that mainland enterprises that are not listed in Shanghai, listed in Hong Kong, that they might begin to migrate back to Shanghai for a second listing. And this could be due purely to commercial reasons, because the PE is higher in Shanghai. So if you are a business owner, you say, hey, maybe I should list up north. And the buying power is there. And no matter what you think, the Shanghai Connect and the Shenzhen Connect actually is not that convenient for the investors from mainland itself. Now, I want to turn my attention to the mitigation measures that the Hong Kong SAR government has introduced. One of the things is that there would be a cash payout of $10,000 for every one of us, which is good because for many households, it would ease the cash flow, it would increase employment. But because it's a one-off thing, I don't think it would permanently change the spending habits. In fact, savings rate is likely to go up rather than come down in the next months. And one thing that we observe, we all know that Americans never save. But even in the last couple of months, we've seen that the savings rate has gone up in the US quite a bit. Because looking at the future, if you are living in the US, you become an employee and so forth, what do? You're not going to spend. You might get a check soon, maybe from the US Treasury. You're not going to spend it all, right? You're going to save part of it, okay? And I think that's what's going to happen. But regardless, I think it's not a bad idea. I think the government is getting ready to launch an employment subsidy scheme called ESS, which means that employers will be given some kind of subsidy if they commit, not to lay off any workers, and then they will get the benefit for 6 months, okay? Which I think is a good thing, because that is what is needed, especially since Hong Kong doesn't have unemployment insurance, okay? In the US, there are now more than 30 million people getting unemployment checks, okay, because they have unemployment insurance. We don't, okay? So I think it's good that we have ESS to help these people tide over for a while. I think they will be helpful in keeping the economy afloat amidst falling GDP and rising unemployment, but they won't be enough to turn the economy around. That's why I use the word afloat, okay? It's not going to help coming back. But a lot of people worry about whether Hong Kong can afford it. And I've done a very simple calculation. I think everybody knows that eventually all of these measures together will cost about 300 billion Hong Kong dollars. And that would be about a deficit equal to 10% of the Hong Kong GDP, annual GDP. This is very high by Hong Kong standards, even by international standards, but I think we can afford it. Hong Kong can afford it. So first thing is don't worry about this. You can afford it because Hong Kong still has accumulated surplus about 1 trillion Hong Kong dollars. So this is about less than one third of it. So in principle, we can run this deficit for 3 years and still don't need to borrow. So put your mind at ease that this is okay. And I think it's justified at this time to spend that kind of money. Now, we are actually not in too bad a shape because you look at the US, they are doing the same thing, okay, more or less, okay, passing money out and giving money to corporations and so forth. For the US, the projected deficit for this year is going to be 18% of GDP. 18%. It's a huge number. And the US has a public debt already of over 100% of GDP. By the end of the year, it will make the public debt about 120% of GDP. Now, Japan also has a deficit. I think this year it will have a deficit equal to 5.8% of GDP. But Japan already has a public debt of more than 250% of GDP. So the reason I say this, all of this, is that don't worry, we can do it, and it's not going to kill us. Moreover, we have almost no public debt. So we have a lot of ample borrowing capacity. So if we need to, we can borrow, but we don't need to. All right. So the first thing is that don't worry whether we can afford it. We can afford it, and we should spend the money as long as it's well spent. So I actually fully support the government mitigation measures. But I do want to point out that these measures alone, I want to emphasize, these measures alone are not sufficient to turn the economy around. Okay, that we have to know. Because you want to ask the question, what's going to happen in 6 months when the ESS runs out? You know, I mean, you talk about ESS, okay, I commit not to lay off anyone. But take a company like Cathay Pacific and Cathay Dragon. They have canceled, apparently, more than 95% of their flights worldwide. How can they keep paying its employees when there's really nothing to do, literally nothing to do? And you cannot keep on. I mean, maybe with government help, you can do it for 6 months, but what happens after 6 months, right? So it's a temporary measure keeping us afloat, but that is actually not enough, all right? So that's something important to remember. Now, I want to say that Hong Kong, with a linked exchange rate system, LERS, but more commonly known as the PAC, we have a fixed PAC, cannot have an independent monetary policy, all right? That we know. So unlike most other governments in the world, we are not free to print money, which is actually a good thing. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. It's a good thing that we cannot print money at will, all right? But that means we cannot do our quantitative easing, so Hong Kong can only use fiscal policy to stimulate the economy. Now, giving out money is fiscal policy. ESS is also fiscal policy. But I want to say that public investment and public consumption are also part of fiscal policy. I think we really cannot assume that the traditional service industries in Hong Kong, entertainment, food and beverages, retail, tourism and travel, that they will all come back after the COVID-19 epidemic. We cannot assume that. In fact, I think that is not going to be the case. The rest of the world is still in recession. Tourism and travel is not going to come back anytime soon. Retail, which depends quite a great deal on tourism, is also going to be very difficult. While the mainland economy, I think, will recover fairly quickly, and there will be additional economic stimulus that China should be able to do around 5% for 2020 as a whole. let me say, is with additional economic stimulus. Okay, if nothing is done, I think it would be around between 3 and 4. But it's not important. The important thing is that even if it's just 5, 4, 3, I think mainland tourists and even students, they are unlikely to come back in large numbers in the short term because of perceived unfriendliness and hostility to them among some segments of the Hong Kong population. But I think even Hong Kong residents themselves, they will be more careful and reserved in their spending, in their dining out and social gathering and so forth. And social distancing, I think we will continue to practice. I think I probably won't shake anyone's hands for a long time, okay? And certainly no kissing and hugging. So people would be very careful. And I think quite properly so. As long as we don't have a vaccine and we don't have a specific viral drug that would treat this particular virus, it's always better to be careful. The other thing is we private fixed investment. If you're the boss of a business in Hong Kong, are you going to invest, commit large sums to invest today? No, you're going to wait. What I'm trying to say is that if the government has to come in and make up the slack, this is what the government is for. And that's why we have to have public investment and public consumption, to keep up the aggregate demand. Right? If you just leave it alone, they won't come back. So Hong Kong has to think through and plan now as to what to do in 6 months. And I think increasing public investment and public consumption is the most likely option and the most viable option at this moment. But I think one has to remember that even before these public investments are implemented, the announcement per se, just the government saying we're going to do this, they would actually lift expectations, and which will also have to lift the rest of the economy. And they will do what the mitigation measures alone cannot do. That is, they will enhance public confidence and transform negative expectations of the future into positive ones. And that's what you need, is positive expectations going forward. Now, an economy is basically driven by public confidence and its expectations about the future. You really think about it, that's what is going to drive things. And there are two famous examples of powerful announcement effects and new policies. You probably still remember the Southern Inspection Tour of Mr. Deng Xiaoping. The Chinese economy was very depressed in 1990, 91, and so forth. And the Southern Inspection Tour all of a sudden changed things, and the economy became alive all of a sudden. Okay. The other important example was in 2008, when China announced the 4 trillion yuan economic stimulus program that also overnight had a great effect. And that is really why, if the government can come out with a credible plan, a credible announcement of public investment, public consumption, that can turn things around. I think in the near term, households and firms in Hong Kong must be assured that peace and harmony will be restored and law and order will be maintained. This is the only way for expectations to turn positive. Otherwise, I think whatever the government tries to do is just like rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. Now, what are some potential new initiatives? First, I think that the government should accelerate investment projects already in the pipeline, such as the third runway and the reclamation and construction of an artificial island east of Landau Island, and launch additional public housing projects. This is the slack period. You should do it, accelerate them. Secondly, I would suggest that the government should facilitate the introduction of 5G mobile communication services in Hong Kong through the sponsorship and construction of a shared public network of 5G transmission towers. You see, in most countries, each firm, each provider, service provider, will construct its own network of towers. But there's no reason for them to each, it's duplicative and wasteful. So if the government can do it and run it like a public utility, regulated public utility, it would be great for all the consumers in Hong Kong because it will lower costs. You would eliminate duplicative investment. The government can also take advantage of this to do some green investments. There are hundreds, literally, of government buildings, public buildings in Hong Kong. They are not energy efficient, okay? And they can be retrofitted to be energy efficient, right? Changing windows, converting to solar power, and doing various things. You can be converted and retrofitted. And if you retrofit, actually, you come out ahead. Why? Because there's an initial capital cost, but then you benefit almost forever, right, for the life of the building. So if you discount it, you actually come out ahead. It's a good investment. This is a time to do it. It's something that Hong Kong can do, and would create demand and employment. The other thing I was thinking about is that you can also make a building healthy. What do I mean by making a building healthy? You can make a building that would have automated doors, so I don't have to pull the handle, right? And you could have automated temperature fever detection, but you can also have voice-activated lifts, right? I want to go to 19th floor, right? 19th floor. So that actually would eliminate the necessity of contact with physical things, because I think a lot of the infection can actually come from everybody, touching the same door handle or pressing the same elevator button. I think the last time when SARS happened in Hong Kong, that's exactly what happened, is that people got infected in the Metropolitan Hotel because they share the elevator. The other thing that we can do is to augment the public health infrastructure, take advantage of this downturn to build more hospitals, to build more elderly care homes and so forth that would meet the public health standards. This is the time to do it, and maybe expand medical school and nursing schools. We know we need more doctors. People are getting older and older. We need more doctors. We need more nurses. This is the time to do that. Increasing supply of land for residential use. I think you are in the forefront of this. And I think one is reclamation, we will talk about. The second thing I want to propose is the redevelopment of the Kwai Chung container terminals. Because now we don't need it anymore. And there's terminals in Yantian, which is very close by. And it's basically owned by the same people, right? So they are not going to be hurt by this. So I think that is something that can be done. And I actually have been advocating taking a very small part of country parks and green belts. This is going to make me unpopular, but taking a very small percentage and for residential use. I think we should do that because Hong Kong actually only uses 7% of our land area for residential use, and less than a quarter of our land area will be developed. It's very, very low. We have to do something about housing. We need to enhance Hong Kong's status as an international financial center, and there are various things we can do. I think green bonds is one of them. We can establish ourselves to be the center for the issuance and trading of green bonds. There's a huge market for it. We can start with the GPA. Promoting owner-occupied housing. I've been advocating for years that we should have long-term fixed-rate mortgages. Why? Because a long-term mortgage will reduce your monthly payments enormously. A 35-year mortgage, you pay only half of what you have to pay on a 15-year mortgage. If you have a fixed rate, you eliminate the interest rate risk because interest rate will go up and down. Now it's down. There are times that it would be up. And if you have fixed rate, you eliminate the risk. But in order to do that, the government has to play an active role because no commercial bank has long-term deposits at fixed rate that they can finance these long-term mortgages. Only the government can issue bonds at a fixed rate for 35 years and then use the proceeds to buy qualified mortgages, also fixed rate mortgages. Now is really a great time, okay? And because long-term rates are extremely low today, okay? Hong Kong can probably borrow at 1.5%, and mortgage corp doesn't have to make money, so it can actually relent the money. You can buy mortgages at, let's say, 1.75%, right, or at most 2%, and it can give the originating banks a service fee for continuing to service the mortgage, right? So I think everybody ought to be happy if we have this, and this will open up enormously affordability of housing. And if you already have a mortgage, you can refinance, and you will actually get cash in your pocket if you refinance. Not only your cash flow improves, but you can actually get some money back from the bank. Then we need to create jobs that cannot move away. And let me just mention a few things. R&D and venture capital hub. This is something we need to do. In order to do this, we need to become also a graduate education hub. You cannot run an R&D without a good graduate education. And we know Silicon Valley and Route 128, they're all built around great universities. And we can do the same. We could also do top-notch healthcare and reinsurance. So let me conclude that there are many things that Hong Kong can and should do. The government can augment domestic aggregate demand by undertaking public investment and other measures. I've given lots of examples above. Hong Kong should take advantage of this crisis to map out a vision for Hong Kong's future within the framework of one country, two systems. It's time for the government to help the public by providing answers to the following questions. What should Hong Kong be like 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now? We need a vision of the future, right? It's not planning, but we do need to have a vision. Positive non-interventionism is really a clever excuse, very clever excuse for doing nothing. It is not a viable strategy in a rapidly changing world. Okay, I think the British invented it just so that they didn't have to do anything. Nurturing recruitment and retention of human capital is critical for Hong Kong's long-term future. Let me stop here. Thank you very much.